Welcome to History 1301. This is a continuation of our 1301 class. What we're going to be talking about in this series is English colonialism continued. In the previous series, you should have taken a look at what was going on in Jamestown, and that should have brought you up to the 1620s at least. So we're now moving forward from the 1620s, and we're going to get out to the 1670s. The next presentation now after this one takes you through from the 1650s to 1700. So don't get confused about where you're at on this thing. Just use your common sense. I'll try and have them labeled so that you can go about these chronologically. So in this particular presentation, we're talking about the Plymouth Bay Colony, and finally we're getting to this idea that most Americans carry with them about early English colonialism, that it's all about religion. Well, the Plymouth Bay Colony was that way. So we'll talk about government, and that's going to be divided up into two parts. First, we'll have a theocratic society, which is the Plymouth Bay Colony, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on back in Parliament, so you have a feel for how the government back in England is working. Some of you may have a good idea of what a parliamentary form of government is like, but we need to kind of go over that in just a few words. So I'm going to have one slide on that. We'll proceed on, and we're going to talk about continued expansion with the Native Americans. That will lead us to King Philip's War, and then we'll also talk about another one, another event in 1675 called Bacon's Rebellion. Now, I have on this particular lead-in slide religion, witchcraft, Great Awakening, all that, including John Peter Zenger and developing commerce. All that is farther on down the line. So that's another series of lectures that are after. Most of those are like in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Just so you know, developing commerce, that's all about the slave trade, and I have a long presentation on that. It takes forever to get through the slave trade. So if you're seeing this online, make sure you set aside plenty of time to get through that slide. Last but not least, and this is going to be a continuing theme, follow the bouncing ball. We have to go back and forth across the Atlantic like time after time after time. We will do that on this series of slides, and we're going to do it again on slides coming up, other presentations moving forward. So with that in mind then, let's move on to the next slide and have a little bit of introduction on the Plymouth Bay Colony. So here we are, the Plymouth Bay Colony, and this is what's really going on. I'm going to spend some time on this slide. Usually in class, I'll talk about some of the things that are going on this slide and then move forward and then come back to this slide. But on this YouTube presentation, that doesn't seem to be a particularly useful way to go about it. So don't get confused on this. We're going to go through this entire slide, and then I'll move forward, and I'll have to, just because of the nature of it, I'll reiterate or cover some of the things that I've covered on this slide again. And so what we have here is just a series of building blocks. Every one of these bullet points is a building block. Again, take very, very strong notes. For those of you who are printing off these slides, you can kind of do a screenshot and then just print the slide off. That's your business, but make sure that with every one of these bullet points, you write down the bullet point and then leave a long gap in between in your notes, so that you can write down what I'm saying. And then I'll transition on to the next bullet point, and then you can write down a series of notes on that. Leave a gap in your notes. And continue to go on that. In other words, if you just write all this stuff down, you'll be very confused in your notes. I'll transition from one bullet point to the next. So let's start then. In circa 1620, that is to say, they landed in 1620, but we're talking about the Plymouth Bay Colony, and it's from 1620 to 1691. So in 1620, 102 pilgrims land near modern Boston. And so pilgrims, the first thing that you need to know there, pilgrim just means traveler. It's just an old-fashioned way of saying traveler. But they land near north of Boston, modern-day Boston, a little ways, in the Plymouth Bay area. And they're going to occupy an abandoned Native American site, and they're going to call it Plymouth, after the city, the port city where they left from in England. Okay, so the first thing that's important about that is, in contrast to the Jamestown settlement, within a couple of days down in Jamestown, Captain John Smith had contact with the Native Americans down there. But here the Native Americans, the Narragansetts and Wampanoags, have moved away from this area near the coast. The land there was marginal. It wasn't very good for farming, and they had stayed there for a while. And as the Native Americans do, they're semi-nomadic. So they'll stay there for a while until they use up the resources, and then they'll move to a second site, and then a third site, and a fourth site. And I've already kind of talked about that. I've mentioned that when we talked about the French. The Native Americans are semi-nomadic, and they're always on the move. Well, they had been at this site, and then they had moved on. And so when the Plymouth Bay Colony settles down there, it's going to be months and months and months before they run into the first Native Americans. And by that time, it's spring. They're having a hard time getting, plants going. They're having a hard time. They're basically starving. And so the Native Americans do, in their generosity, aid the Plymouth Bay Colony. And that's how they get through it. But we will talk about that a little bit later on. It's going to wind up being bad for the Native Americans, and I've already suggested that. But when we get to Matacamet's Rebellion, King Philip's War, that'll be the beginning of the end for the Native Americans in the Plymouth Bay area. So let's transition now and talk about seeking spiritual toleration for Puritan interpretation. Now, clear out a big giant space in your notes for this one, because it's going to take forever to get through this. But this is a building block thing, and we have to go through it. We have to get past this. So we're talking now about a Puritan interpretation of the Scriptures. And this leads us back to the events of 1517, 1519. In Germany, there was a monk named Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, that's a different guy. So we're in Germany, in Wittenberg, I don't know, about 50 miles south of Berlin, at a big giant monastery there in Wittenberg. And this monk, Martin Luther, was having a very difficult time understanding, what's going on within the church. He had been raised to take over the family business. That did not work out. The story goes that he was traveling from one location to another, and a terrible storm came up. And he prayed to St. Anne that if he got out of the storm alive, he would dedicate his life to the worship of God. St. Anne is the patron saint of miners, and that's what his dad did. He had a series of coal mines and salt mines. Well, to make a long story short, he went into the church as a monk, and he was always very nervous about the well-being of his soul. And he prayed and prayed and prayed, and he had a very difficult time of it. If you ever see early pictures of Martin Luther drawings, I think there was one by Thomas Cranach that's very, very good. You see a man that's definitely worried. Hollow cheek, big bags under his eyes. He's really skinny and just starving himself to death because he's eaten up with the well-being of his soul. Well, the abbot there sent him on a pilgrimage to Rome to help him to overcome this. Maybe that would help him out. Plus, you could just imagine he was confessing his sins 2 or 3 times a day, and was driving the other monks crazy. Because here he was at a monastery. He wasn't committing any sins, but it was he's driving them all nuts with his obsession over the well-being of his soul. He didn't want to go to hell. Fair enough. Well, they sent him off to Rome, and it was a really spectacularly bad experience for Martin Luther. Everywhere he went, other monks within the church, another priest were trying to shake him down for money. There was a huge giant tourist trap, and it was horrible. Here he was on this spiritual journey, and he was being maltreated everywhere he went. Shoved around and shaken down for money and shaken down for more money. He's like, listen, I'm here for the well-being of my soul. And they were like, well, we don't care about your soul. We want the money. So Martin Luther went back to Germany. He had a long, literally soul-searching. And he said, okay, there's a lot of corruption going on in the church. Another corruption that was going on, and I'm trying to be very brief with this, but you need to understand what's really going on with these Puritans, so we have to kind of start at the start. Another abuse that was going on was the selling of indulgences. In Germany, there was a famous monk, and his name was Johann Tetzel, Tetzel. And Johann Tetzel was selling these indulgences. And an indulgence, to make a long story short, the Pope would write a letter saying, listen, I'm prepared as the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, to absolve you of sin. and this is called a papal bull, B-U-L-L, papal bull. Well, Johann Tetzel would take little slips of paper, write on there, he'd just have a whole bunch of them printed up. I've actually seen these, they're still like, you can find them in Germany anywhere in an antique store or something like that, because there are thousands of these made up. And it just has a list of the things that you're absolved of, and then there's this long blank space where you fill in the name, and then, there's like the price, like 10 shillings or 10 marks or whatever it is. And one of these I remember reading, you're absolved of all sin for, a period of 10 days. And that was like 5 marks, and which was a lot of money back in those days. Well, so what these indulgences are is a get-out-of-hell-free card. Well, what the church was doing, and again, this is the Catholic Church of then, not the Catholic Church of now, they were just playing on the superstitions of the people, and they were not doing the pastoral work that they were supposed to be doing. The church at the time was under the control of some bad popes, Julius II, but especially Leo X, and then one of these Borgia popes, I think Alexander I, and then Clement III. So there was a series of really, really bad popes. Anyway, this bothered Martin Luther, and he's like, listen, that's not the way it's supposed to be. And here he was, a monk and an abbot, or not an abbot, but he was a monk and he was a lawyer for the church, and he knew what the Bible said. So he wrote what's called the 95 Theses. This is October 31st, 1519. And he nailed it to the church door at the Church of Wittenberg. Now, and I've seen some websites around, and please don't get confused on this, saying that no, he didn't actually nail this up to the church door. Yes, he did. This was a traditional message to the church from the community. And so it's perfectly ordinary to nail up signs on the church door, so that the abbot, the prelate, would get it and be able to read it to the bishop. This is what the people are thinking. So I nailed up the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and saying, listen, something's really gone badly wrong, and we have got to reform. And so the controversy went on and on and on, and to make a long story short, Martin Luther was like chased away, and Leo X was not going to reform anything. He was making too much money, which is what he wanted. And so Martin Luther was in hiding, and he got all the resources that he could get his hands on: Greek, Roman, Latin, Aramaic, everything that he could get his hands on that was all about the scriptures. And he did a completely new translation of the Bible into the vernacular, that is to say, not into Latin, but into German. And then he began to have this published all over the place. And so this is the Lutheran Bible, which, as it turns out, is very close to the King James Version. They're like very, very closely related. So all the Germans began to read the Bible for themselves, and this was a heresy, a terrible heresy, because it meant that the church has lost control of the scriptures. When it was in Latin, the Roman Church controlled it, and now it was in German, so the Germans could read it for themselves, and they understood they'd been getting bamboozled. Well, this is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This is the beginning of Protestantism. It wasn't called Protestantism until later on, 1635, I think, with the defenestration in Prague. But that's a separate issue. Now we need to move forward a little bit and get to England. So it's the 1530s, and in England, we're talking about this. We're trying to get to Puritanism. In England, the king at the time was Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII was in desperate need of a divorce. He was married to Catherine of Aragon. That was his first wife. And they'd had a daughter. And that's later on, that's going to be Mary. There's going to be a whole lot of Marys. Just get ready for it. But what the king wanted, what Henry VIII wanted, was a son. He wanted a clear line of succession, so that when he died, the throne would be safe in the hands of a son. In his own lifetime, England had gone through the War of the Roses. And this was all about dynastic changes. And he didn't want that. He wanted stability. And for that, he had to have a son. He was obsessed. Well, his wife, Catherine of Aragon, she had this daughter, and then she couldn't have any other children, for whatever reason. Furthermore, Henry VIII fell in lust with Anne Boleyn. But Anne Boleyn wasn't going to have it. She was like, listen, I'm not going to be your mistress. You got to divorce the queen and then marry me, and then we can start, getting, trying to have kids. So, for reasons we don't have time to get in here right now, the Pope Leo X said to Henry VIII, I'm not going to give you a divorce. It was all about politics. It was all about dynastic problems. There was like all sorts of problems. So Henry VIII concluded, okay, well, then England has to break from the Roman Church, because in Protestantism you could have divorce. Now Henry VIII did not want to break from the church. He was a strong Roman Catholic, but he needed a divorce. So he said, okay, in 1535, strong note here, he signed the Act of Supremacy. 1535, the Act of Supremacy. And that meant that Henry VIII was the head of the Church of England. And the Church of England was supreme in England. That's where everything was going to flow from the Church of England. Now, this didn't lead to any direct changes within how the Catholic faith was taught, because all the bishops and all the prelates and all the cardinals in England, they were all Catholics, Roman Catholics. So it didn't lead to any big changes for the people. But Henry was able, as the head of the Church of England, he was able to say, I'm going to grant myself a divorce, and he did. Well, the problem then, as time goes on, is that the Protestant church begins to splinter. There are different interpretations. The Holy Scriptures are a highly interpretive document. And so there's all sorts of different interpretations. You have Erasmus over in Holland, and you have John Calvin, and he's Swiss, as it turns out, and they have slightly different interpretations than Martin Luther did about what the Bible means and how to interpret all the various elements of it. So the church itself begins to splinter. Now, time goes on. Henry VIII is going to die, and he did have a son. Anne Boleyn didn't give him a son, and she had a daughter, Elizabeth. And so Henry got obsessed with having a son, so he had Anne Boleyn beheaded. And then he married Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour did give him a child, a boy, and that will be Edward IV. But then Jane Seymour, God bless her, she died just a couple of days after of an infection. So she had the baby, and then she died. Well, then he had another wife, Anne of Cleves. That didn't work out. That ended in a divorce. Then he had another wife. What was her name? Elizabeth. And then he had her head chopped off. And then he had one more wife, and I can't remember. Catherine Parr. So and she lived. So Henry VIII did have 6 wives. So you can always remember them: divorced, beheaded, died; divorced, beheaded, survived. And that's how you can remember the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Anyway, let's get rid of him. We go to Edward. Now, Edward is really raised. This is Henry VIII's son by Jane Seymour. So Edward was raised by Catherine Parr, the last wife, and she was a very strong Protestant, a very strong Protestant. And so he agreed with the Protestant Church and Protestant Reformation. Well, he didn't last very long. I think he was 14 or 15 years old, and he died. And that leads us then to to Mary. Now, Mary wanted to go back to Catholicism, so she's going to be Bloody Mary. And so she harassed everybody, and she was like really violent and had people burned at the stake for heresy, and she tried to drag England back into Catholicism. But by that time, nobody wanted any part of that. The Pope at the time was Plymouth III, and he was like a really bad Pope, and everybody knew it. Furthermore, all the church land had been sold to the English nobility to solidify Henry VIII's claim. And so they felt like if they ever went back to Catholicism, the Catholic Church would want all the land back, and nobody was going to do that. We already know what land meant in England. If you were a landowner, then you were a big shot. You were somebody. So anyway, Mary, she was married to a Spanish king, Philip, but then she died, and she had no children. They had no children. So then the throne went to Elizabeth. And this continued splintering of the Church of England continues on, because Elizabeth was Protestant. So here we are, late 1500s, and the Puritan movement has splintered off from the Church of England. And the Puritans are exactly what their movement sounds like. They're like, if it's not in the Bible, you can't have it. If it's not in the Bible, you can't have it. So the way they worshipped, the outward appearance of the worship, the part of the theology that they agreed with was like completely different from the Church of England. Now Elizabeth was okay with that because she didn't want a religious war. But then she died. Now here's the problem with Protestantism. I'm sorry, with Puritanism. The monarch, whoever the monarch is the head of the Church of England. I'll say that again so you have a chance to write it down. Whoever the monarch is the head of the Church of England. That's the way it's set up. The head of the Church of England today is Elizabeth II. And she takes her duties as the head of the Church of England very, very seriously indeed. So if you have a disagreement with theology, in effect now, you guys got to think this all the way through, then you're disagreeing with the monarch, and that can be very, very dangerous. So these Puritans kept, they started like thumping and squealing and being disagreeable and saying that the Church of England's got it all wrong. That the Church of England and the people of England have been exposed to the revealed Word of God through the Bible, and they're not doing it right. Well, of course, the Church of England, led by, the monarch, are saying, no, we pretty much got this right. We know what we're doing. Well, when Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, the next monarch is going to be James I. Now, we can dispense with him pretty quickly. He was dynamic and a young king when he came to the throne. I'm sorry, kind of a middle-aged king when he came to the throne in England. He'd been the king of Scotland, and then he becomes the king of England. Well, he really didn't take his duties that seriously. And he was more interested in the money. He was more interested in the theater of being the king. And his interests were not really that deeply religious. Well, for the Puritans, this just makes them all the more angry. So they felt like, and strong note here, they felt like any moment God was going to get really upset with England and destroy it. Please write that down. The Puritans, we're talking about 1605, 1610, 1620s. The Puritans are convinced that God at any moment is going to strike England down for being so sinful. Now, it sounds silly to us today in an era of which, we're becoming more and more secular every year. But please understand, you guys, that in the 1600s, the idea, in other words, God was in your everyday life. The sun came up over the horizon because God's immortal hand brought it over the horizon. The idea that the sun was the center of our solar system, that was an idea that was heretical in Italy. Galileo Galilei almost had to go get burned at the stake. Copernicus was just like coming up with that idea. And so everybody felt like that Earth was the center of the universe, and the entire universe revolved around the Earth. And that's it. So we lived in a very godly time, and people were absolutely panic-stricken about, whether they were doing the right thing or not. So again, please write a strong note on this. When we talk about these Puritans, you have to take their view of these things very seriously indeed. Because for them, their immortal soul was at stake. If you got worship of God wrong, you were in deep, deep trouble. Your soul was at stake. You had to get it right. And that's what they kept telling everybody, and that's what they kept saying to the C of E. You can't be making these mistakes. You'll lead people into eternal damnation. Can't have that. So, a group of these Puritans concluded, again, just continue on with strong notes here. We're still looking for a spiritual toleration from Puritan interpretation. These Puritans concluded, okay, well, we've got to get out of England, because any minute now, God's going to set down his wrath upon this evil country. So they went to Holland. Now, this is an important step. In Holland, the worship of Christianity was done in a way that the Puritans agreed with. Again, this is a guy named Erasmus and also John Calvin. Uh, John Calvin, also John Calvin. So the kind of anglicized version of his name is John Calvin. And they all kind of agreed with what the Puritans were asserting. And so ecumenically, that is to say, in terms of their worship, they fit in very well in Holland. You know, they agreed with that. They agreed with what's going on. The Dutch are a very godly people, and they had pretty much a Puritan view of things. The problem is, and this is why I want you to take good note on this. The problem was that, I don't know how to put this exactly. If you've ever been to Holland, it's kind of strange. The people there are wonderful people. They're very outgoing, very friendly. But they are Dutchy, and I'm not trying to like make anybody embarrassed or perpetuate a stereotype, but I'm telling you right now, every one of them are blonde-haired and blue-eyed and clear complexion. They're very, very Nordic-looking people. And so, if you could imagine all the young ladies there, they look like Scarlett Johansson, and I mean, they do. To this day, they do. And so all the young men wanted to marry Scarlett Johansson. And all the young ladies, they were looking around, and all the guys looked like a young Brad Pitt. And they all wanted to marry Brad Pitt. So this English community in Holland was beginning to lose their English identity. That is the point. Please write that down. The problem with the Puritans in Holland was that they began to lose their English identity. They began to intermarry with the Dutch, and their kids were speaking Dutch, and you know, they didn't want that. They were English, and they wanted to remain English. So they went back to England. And there was this big debate within the church, and the king was getting old, and you know, he was like, you know, not acting very kingly. There was continued backsliding towards Catholicism. All these Catholic elements began to show up in the C of E, and the Puritans, like, they were getting more and more angry about this. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is when they decided to move to America. But please write this down. This gets lost in a whole lot of different textbooks. Especially the American exceptionalists. They want to like kind of bury this element of it. These Puritans insisted on going to America and setting up a community. But when England was destroyed, evidently by hellfire, damnation, and fire and brimstone by God for being a sinful nation, the Puritans concluded that then they could go back to England. The ocean's a highway, not a barrier. But more importantly here, the Puritans had a very strong English identity. The idea was to go to America, wait for God to destroy England, and then they would go back to England. That is like a critical element. Now, I've read a lot of history books, as you guys could imagine, and as far as I know, God has never sent down his wrath upon England before. We're going to leave the Nazis out of this. Okay, so that part of their plan did not work out. God does not work on man's schedule. It's the other way around. So they're looking for a Puritan, toleration for a Puritan interpretation. And that drove them to get, in 1620, to get on a ship, the Mayflower, and head for the colonies, head for the New World. So finally, with all that in mind, with all that background in mind, again, I hope you guys took good notes on this. You will need this later. That's a building block. What I just went over with Martin Luther all the way to the Puritans, that is a building block. You'll need it again later on. So let's transition then and go to the next bullet point. Never influential nor of a large population. So here we have to talk about some theocracy. And I have a slide, the very next slide as it turns out, that talks about this. But since I can't like go back and forth between slides in this presentation, we're going to tackle this right now. And then I'll simply touch on it in the next slide. In Puritanism, there is a dynamic, a social dynamic, that we need to talk about for a few minutes. So again, start taking strong notes here. And this is the idea of the elect. Now, the idea of the elect versus the strangers, more about that in a minute, stems from an element within the scriptures that's referred to as predestination. Predestination. Now, for those of you who know what this is about, you're starting to like shake your head. You're like, okay, I've heard about this before, and it didn't work, and that's true. Predestination as an ecumenical dynamic. Most churches don't really accept that. Now, there is some justification for it, I think, in Romans and in Corinthians. Paul talks about this in his letter to the Romans, but it's a little bit vague. Predestination goes like this. Before time was time, God knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. I'm not trying to preach a sermon here. This is just the way it goes. Before time was time, predestination, before time was time, God already knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. And those who were going to heaven were called the elect. This is what the Puritans called. They believed in predestination. And so the Puritans felt like they got it right. They'd interpreted the scriptures correctly, and they were therefore predestined to go to heaven. Now, everybody else was a stranger. And some of them might go to heaven, and they might go to hell. They have a chance of going to heaven, but they're probably going to go to hell. So the Puritans felt like they had this all sewed up. Now, obviously, and many of you could probably kind of think about this. If you think about this for a few minutes, you can see the problem with it. If you know, as a matter of faith, that you're going to heaven, then anything you do is going to be okay in the eyes of God. In other words, in effect, you can basically commit any sin and get away with it because you know you're the elect. Well, this leads to the next problem. So, think of this as a theocratic society, which, again, I'll talk about this on my next slide. This is a theocratic society that believes that their social dynamic stems from their worship of God. Fine. And then you have a group that says, we're going to heaven, the rest of you aren't going to heaven. Or you only have a shot at going to heaven. Well, how do you tell who is elect and who is a stranger? How do you tell? So think about that for a moment. How on earth do you tell? How can you convince somebody else that you are elect? Can you just look them in the eye and say, well, I'm elect and I know that? That's an article of faith. No, you have to find a way to convince people. In other words, you've got to be able to separate out the wheat from the chaff, and that's what they said at the time. So where does that leave us? Well, the answer lies in prosperity. Now, there's a sidebar here, and this is called the Protestant work ethic. So I disagree with this as an idea because everybody worked very hard back in those days, Catholics and Jews included, everybody did. But this is called the Protestant work ethic, and many American exceptionalists will point to this as really an addition of the Puritan movement in America. Again, I disagree with this. But the idea goes like this. How do you tell the elect from a stranger? So you get up in the morning and you farm 40 acres, you go get eggs from the chickens, and then you get milk from the cow, and you start churning up some butter, and then you go farm 40 acres, and you harvest that, and then you put a roof on the barn, and then you gather a bunch of hay and then you go chop a bunch of wood, and you do all these cool things. And over time, this is the Protestant work ethic, you become prosperous. But think what happens if your neighbor, he put a new roof on his house as well. He's out there working. But you know what? His butter turned rancid. Uh-oh. And then, he put a new roof on the house, and the roof leaked. Uh-oh. And then, he had a bunch of hogs, and they were everything was doing fine, but they got measles and died. Hogs do catch measles, and they do die from it. So, as it turns out, that guy who's working just as hard as you are, he's not prosperous. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that means one thing. God does not love him. Sorry. So where does that leave us then? It really means just exactly this, and please make a strong note about it, because that's what this note is all about, never influential or of a large population. The Puritan community is exclusive, not inclusive. The Puritan community is exclusive, not inclusive. That is to say, it's us and no one else. And very few people are going to be able to join into our little club, our little Puritan club. But Puritans are going to get kicked out all the time because it turns out God doesn't love them. God signaled that he does not love them. Some individual has committed some crime or some sin that the rest of the community disagrees with, and God has removed his, care for that individual, and so they're out. They're not Puritans anymore. They're strangers. They're not elect. So, again, a lot of American exceptionalists disagree with this, but the fact is that there will always, always, always be more strangers than there are elect, because the Puritan community is always throwing people out. In other words, as we go through head into the 1640s in particular, the English Civil War will start in 1642 and it'll go till 1649. And there's going to be a whole lot of people that are trying to get out of England because of all these terrible, terrible religious wars. And so when they arrive, they're like, wow, this is great. More about that in a moment. But they're going to arrive in the Plymouth Bay Colony, and they're going to say, well, I'm not a Puritan. And so the Puritan community is going to be swamped with strangers like right away. Like almost right away. So now moving forward, again, continue on with a really super strong note on this. Like underline this, like point fingers and arrows toward this. You're going to need it later. The elect, obviously, they only want to marry within their community. So only the elect are only going to marry the elect because they don't want their kids to go to heaven. They don't want them to go to hell. And if they marry a stranger, then there's a good, strong chance that they're going to get kicked out of the community of the elect. And it'll be like, okay, well, it turns out you're a stranger after all. So, bam, you're gone. Ugh. Well, then it means that they might go to hell. Remember that God is in your everyday life. So, within a generation or two, you're starting to marry cousins. You're going to start getting intermarriage like really, really quick. And furthermore, as I pointed out, even in the Jamestown colony, women are going to outlive men. So you're going to have women that are like living a lot longer, not entirely, but as a general statement, this is true. The women will live longer, and they're going to start going through men. Well, they're not going to want to sell their property to strangers. They're going to want to keep that property within their elect community. That's who they are. It's very exclusive. It's not inclusive. So the community is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but they are already landowners. And so the land is going to get concentrated in the hands of a few. And this is going to lead to a lot of trouble later on. So looking back at that first bullet point, that's when we know that the Puritan community is finite. 1620 to 1691. After the 1690s, we don't hear about Puritans anymore. They're just going to die out. And that's the nature of being an exclusive community. They're just going to die out. That's all there is to it. So, the last bullet point then, their contribution. Now, this is going to be easy. We can dispense with this one pretty quickly. Their contribution, they're going to establish a colony in a healthier climate. So, let's stop right there and talk about this for a minute. If you look at, if you can think of the globe, you'll see that New England is roughly on the same latitude as England. So crops and agricultural processes that worked in England, they're going to work fine in Massachusetts, in New England. Massachusetts, modern day Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut's the one I'm thinking of, upstate New York. That's almost on the same latitude as England. And so crops that will work in England are going to work in New England. Food that's going to, animal husbandry, cattle, sheep, and like that. If it works in England, it's going to work in the New World in New England. So their climate is just healthier for them because they're coming from England and they're going to New England. Also, and this turns up in several different books, and I thought this was a really interesting point. Down in Virginia, the growing season is longer. It's 600 or 700 miles farther south. But more importantly, the mosquitoes are out longer. And this is going to lead to the transmission of mosquito-borne diseases. Malaria in particular. Malaria is it's out there in the animal population. So a mosquito is going to go out there and eat on some animal that's got malaria in it. And then go, take a blood meal from a human as well and transmit that malaria. But in New England, the growing season is shorter. And so while there are mosquitoes, the rate of incidence for diseases like malaria is much, much less. because the mosquitoes like die out quicker because the season is so much shorter. And so that makes a big difference in longevity. Establishes a better relationship with the natives. They do. They have very good relationship with the natives until 1622, and we will get to, I'm sorry, 1622 and 1644, and we will get to that. I'm sorry, check that, scratch that, not 1622, that was down in Virginia. In 1675, they'll have a very positive relationship with the natives until 1675. So the relationship with the Native Americans is always going to be very popular, very positive at the beginning. The last thing up here is establishes a tradition of self-rule, and that is the Mayflower Compact, which, as it turns out, is, let me see here, is the very next slide, yeah. So let's go on and talk about the Mayflower Compact, and I'll have some things to say about that. And let's move on to the next slide. So here we are with the Mayflower Compact. Now, this is there's a lot of verbiage on here. Don't panic. If I wanted to have you guys have all this verbiage, I would urge you to take it as a handout. So all I want to do is really go over this very quickly and dispel a couple of myths and give you a better interpretation. Now, as a matter of scholasticism, as you can imagine, I'm a historian. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do what's called a document exegesis. I don't know how to spell it. Just look it up. A document exegesis means that we're going to pick this document apart. And we're going to try and interpret, what the various elements of this document means. So here we are. It's December 1620, and they have arrived. They're in, the coastal waters in New England there, in the Massachusetts Bay area. So they've made this journey, and so they go down into the ship, and they say, okay, so let's write up this document, this Mayflower Compact, sorry. And there's been a lot of debate about what it really means. So let's take a look at this thing and see what we can figure out. I want you guys to focus on the way I'm kind of interpreting this, but I'm going to try and give you some conflicting interpretations, and so we can avoid any confusion along down the line. So it starts there, in the name of God, amen. So who's first? God. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subject of our dreaded sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of England, Ireland, France, Wales, King, defender of the faith, etc. Okay, so who's second? The king. They are claiming themselves, identifying themselves as loyal subjects of the king. God comes first, king comes second. So bear that in mind as we go through the rest of this. Having undertaken for the glory of God, again, who comes first? God. And the advancement of the Christian faith, God is first, and the honor of the king and country, king is second. A voice to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Okay, so quick little side note on that. Their permission from King James, this is King James I, to come to the New World, was in their charter, and it said they need to go to Virginia, where there was already a colony. Well, as it turns out, they get on this ship, the Mayflower, and obviously the sailors, they are all strangers, and they're not elect. So they set off from England. I think the journey took almost 8 weeks, 9 weeks. And you can imagine that the relationship between these Puritans, these 102 Puritans, and the sailors, of which there had to be about 60 or 70 of them on this tiny little ship, it had to be pretty abrasive. In other words, the sailors, being sailors, they're Christians, but they're certainly not Puritans. And the Puritans were all very, they were very uppity. They were very, we're the elect and you guys aren't. And so there was a lot of abrasion there. So the first time they sighted land, the sailor said, hey, that's Virginia. I can recognize it from here. In other words, what are they telling these Puritans? Get the hell off my ship. That's all they want them to do. Get off the ship. So obviously they're not in Virginia. They're like 600 or 700 miles away from Virginia. But when the ship put into harbor, when they put into Massachusetts Bay, the sailors said, you're going to shore. This is it. So plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another. Okay, now listen to the change in verbiage. In the presence of God, he's number one, and one another. Now who's number two? It's not the king, it's one another. Covenant to combine ourselves, us, together into civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. And the first and so forth said. Okay, so here's where many people misinterpret this document. And they want to suggest that it's the first sort of declaration of independence, that it's the first step towards independence. That is not true. What these Puritans are doing are bringing their English laws with them. All they're saying, and this is kind of like in the rest of the sentence here, all they're saying is we're just going to set up a community and set up some, simple rules for our community that we can all live by. And that's what it says next. And by virtue hereof, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinance, acts, and constitutions in office, from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. They're submitting to English law. Please write a strong note here. The whole idea here, the whole reason I'm going through this slide, these Puritans are bringing their English law with them. They're not splitting from England. They're not. They're simply saying, listen, we put up this community here. Nobody else is around us, like in the immediate vicinity, except the Native Americans. And so we're going to throw together a few laws that we think ought to, fit our community so that we can have, an orderly community. They're bringing their English law with them. There's nothing odd about this. They're not splitting from England. They're not. So if you hear that sort of thing, like, I don't know, on the the History Channel, ignore it. This is not the first step towards independence by any stretch of the imagination. As I pointed out before, then when they went to Holland, do you see? That's why I pointed this out before. When they went to Holland, they started to lose their English identity. So they went back to England. Now they're coming to the New World. They are bringing their English identity with them. So the last paragraph. In witness whereof we have subscribed our names at Cape Cod on the 11th of November in the reign of our and the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France, Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, 1620. I don't know, King James was not the 18th. He might have been the 18th. I don't even think he was the 18th king since the conquest. He was King James the First of England. And of Scotland, he was King James the Fifth. King James the Fourth of Scotland. So I don't know where they got those numbers, and it doesn't make any difference anyway. And it was December, it wasn't November. So that's the Mayflower Compact. All I really want you guys to get out of this document is they're bringing their English laws with them. So with that in mind, let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this theocratic society. Let's move on. Now, here we are. You can see from the map there in the upper left, the Boston and Plymouth Bay colonies. There's Providence, Rhode Island, which was part of the Plymouth Bay Colony at the time. It was split later on, obviously, and become Rhode Island. But this is kind of where we're at. So, theocratic society, the elect versus the strangers, and I've already gone over that, so we're not going to go over that again. Escaping a marginal conditions in England and against the C of E's. Church of England, C of E, from here on out, when you hear me say C of E, that means Church of England. This is sort of shorthand. So, seeking a religious freedom, especially predestination. Okay, we've already talked about that, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But this last bullet point, I do want to spend a little bit of time on that. Politicized religious leaders or politicians with spiritual motivation. In other words, this is the root problem with the Plymouth Bay Colony, and it always will be. Are your religious leaders politicized, or do you happen to have a politician who's like hiding behind religion? And our best example of that is Anne Hutchinson. I almost forgot her name. Anne Hutchinson. She's in your textbook. Feel free to look her up. And the story of Anne Hutchinson is very, very well known. But in brief, the story of Anne Hutchinson goes like this. So Anne Hutchinson and her husband were thought of as being the elect. They were upstanding members of the church. They were there every Sunday. Anne Hutchinson was something of an expert on the Bible, as you will discover. And so she approached the church leadership one day, and she said, listen, as it turns out, I've read the Bible many times, and I've had a thought. Is it possible that all souls are equals in the eyes of God? And the church leadership, they didn't even have to think about that. They were like, yes, of course, all souls are equal in the eyes of God. And so she said, well, if proceeding from that point, all souls are equal in the eyes of God, then on this plane of existence, we should be, have some equality within the church. And what Anne Hutchinson was angling for, she wanted to be a church officer. She wanted to be a deacon. She wanted to have church office herself. And this was immediately seen as heresy from the rest of the church leader. And this is Increase Mather. And later on, it's going to be another guy named Cotton Mather. And they were the head of the church of the Puritan church in Boston. They founded the Old North Church. And so they were like, heck no, you can't have, women can't have church office. It's just not their place, it's not their position. But Anne Hutchinson persisted, and she kept saying, listen, I'm doing all these readings. I'm talking to the rest of the community. I know the Bible as well as anybody else. My husband and I are very, very prosperous. We're doing the right things, and we are the elect. And I should have church office equal to anybody else because my soul is equal to everybody else. Well, this was seen as a heresy. So again, we're talking about politicized religious leaders or politicians with a spiritual motivation. In other words, did the church leadership want exclusivity? Do they want that to be a male society? Well, is that a religious thing or is that a political thing? So to make a long story short, they said to Anne Hutchinson, okay, well, we're basically going to put you on a religious trial. And they isolated her from her husband. It was cold, and they wouldn't let her, have any heat, and she would get hungry, and they wouldn't let her have any food, and they wouldn't let her get cleaned up or change clothes. And they, kept her locked up, actually, in the church building. Well, this went on for a long time. And they would wake her up in the middle of the night, and they would say, okay, well, what about this and that, and what about Leviticus, and what about Deuteronomy? And here's the problem, what do you say about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And she would have them every time. God bless her, they would wake her up in the middle of the night, and she had an answer. She knew the Bible at least as well as anybody else. So this was very, very frustrating to the church leadership, because she was catching them on the hop, and she was busting on them. And they would say, well, what about this idea and what about that idea? And man, she had an answer right there on the spot. She knew what she was talking about. Well, they finally, ladies and gentlemen, they finally wore her down. And they just kept wearing her down and kept wearing her down and kept her isolated and worried all the time. And they just got her exhausted. And finally, she slipped. And she suggested that God had spoken to her. And this, you can't have this. You absolutely can't have that. Even among the Puritans, this is called direct revelation, and you can't have direct revelation. So then they could safely expel her, having basically, abused her in this way. They caught her and they wore her down and broke her down, and she made a mistake. And so her and her husband were ejected, and they had to go down to Rhode Island. And tiny little side note here: Rhode Island is going to be this continued place where people who are ejected from the Puritan church, who somehow discover that they are no longer the elect, they all go down to Rhode Island. And so Rhode Island, even to this very day, that is a place where all the rebels without a cause, that's where they all go. So as more and more strangers, and you can see from the map up there, this big red blotches, as more and more English come over, they are almost all strangers and only very few Puritans. And the Puritan community is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because they're very, very exclusive, not inclusive. Also want to take a second to give you a few notes on the map there. I have on there European settlements circa 1650. Again, the Puritans around 1620. So as time goes on, the Dutch, they're laying part of a claim to the New World, and they start putting in a series of colonies. Peter Stuyvesant and Michael de Ruyter, They began a colony there, and it's going to go up and down the Hudson River Valley, and they'll be very influential right until the 1680s, really. Then the 1680s are going to be a series of wars between the Dutch and the English, and the English will take over those Dutch communities. But there's going to be a lot of, a tremendous Dutch colony going all up and down the Hudson River Valley and the southern part of Long Island, modern-day New York. At the time, of course, it's called New Amsterdam. And so there's also going to be a large Swedish community there in Sweden, and this is in the upper reaches of the Delaware Bay. And so the Swedish, they are always very much overpopulated. They're going to try some colonies there as well. They're going to be very poor. The Swedish government is like basically bankrupt. The king, Adolphus I and Adolphus II, they didn't really want these people to go. But there's going to be this huge series of religious wars lasting all the way until 1648 that are really motivating people to come to the New World. There's going to be one religious war after another, after another, after another, after another back in Europe over these Protestantism versus Catholicism. Millions will die, God knows, and people are desperately trying to escape to come to the New World. Again, I've mentioned this before, the biggest motive for many of these people to come to the New World is not riches or treasure. It's not to, smell the sweet air of liberty. It is escape. Their situation back in Europe is horrible. It's either go to America or die. It really is that bad. So the colonies are beginning to spread. Again, there's English, Swedish, Dutch. There's Puritans versus just regular Protestants, C of E sort of thing. And the population is beginning to increase. So with that in mind, let's go on to the next step, and this is we're heading into the 1620s. So 1607 to 1624, and this is the Puritan colony. We're still talking about that. But we're going to include here also the Jamestown colony. Now, you're an intrepid historian, that's me. I did a lot of research on this and counted a lot of heads and looked at records after records after records. And it turns out that about 14,000 colonists had gone to the New World between the Plymouth Bay Colony and the Jamestown Colony. But there's a series of basically inventories, and in 1624 there's only 1,132 colonists still there. So that's a discrepancy of 12,000 colonists, if I did the math right. Now I have a series of question marks there. What the heck is going on here? And usually when I'm in class, and if I'm in class talking to you guys about this, I'm going to stop and we're going to discuss this. We're going to try and figure this out. But I want to just move on from this. What happened to those 12,000 people? Now, to be clear, if the Native Americans had killed them, there would have been a very serious war, and the King of England would have been involved. In other words, even James I, who was really, kind of a playboy king, and wanted all the theater, he would have taken this very seriously. He took his job as the king very seriously. And so if the Indians had killed that many, if the Native Americans had killed that many colonists, no way. So the other thing, well, could it be disease? And disease and starvation did kill many. But if it had killed 12,000, the king would have intervened. Again, somebody, Parliament or the king, probably would have intervened and said, listen, there's something going on there that's killing you all off. And I'm not going to let my people go there just in order to die. So, strong note here. What happens to those 12,000 people? Most of them went back to England. The ocean is a highway, not a barrier. Many of those 12,000 are going to take a long, hard look at what's going on in the colonies, and they're going to say, I'm not staying here. And they are going to go back to England. Now, down in Jamestown, you'd think, okay, well, wouldn't the corporation stop that from happening? No, the corporation's not in the business of starting colonies. The corporation's in the business of making money. So if you're in Jamestown and you go back to the London company and you say, listen, I want transport back to England, they're going to say, fine, you just have to pay for that. And you'll say, listen, I'll be an indentured servant back in England, or I have all this tobacco that I made, or I have all this land, and I'm just going to give you deed and title of the land back, and a whole bunch of tobacco, and I'm going back to England. We talked about this before. John Rolfe, he went back to England. He made a pile of money on tobacco and he went back to England. So the ocean's a highway, not a barrier. Again, this is I keep suggesting this, and I want you guys to remember it. I'm a transatlantic historian, and so the idea that the American exceptionalists have, that all the very best and brightest came to America and those are the ones that survived, that's absurd. The ocean is a highway, not a barrier, and these people are going to go back to England if they don't like it in America, and that's going to be a continuing dynamic moving forward. So the next bullet point there, the end of the London Company, 1623, 1624. Very quickly, and that's the next bullet point as well, mismanagement. The London Company, also known as the Jamestown Company, also known as the Virginia Company, they changed their name several times, got caught in some embezzlement. In other words, the colony wasn't making enough money for some of the guys that were involved, the management, and so they misdirected some of the money and embezzled it. Well, this became widespread. This became known to the rest of the investors. And if you're an investor, even today, in any company, and you find out that there's mismanagement or corruption, you pull your investment out. You say, I want my money back. You know, I'm selling out. Here's my stock. Give me my cash back. Well, if one or two people do that, fine. But if a whole bunch of people do that, that's bankruptcy, which is exactly what happened. Now, please write a strong note here. Let's continue on to the last bullet point there, Royal Colony. So this is our first example, and I pointed out that this is going to happen, and now it is. The charter had been given by James I to the London Company, the Virginia Company. And now the Virginia Company's gone bankrupt, but the colonists are still in Jamestown. In this case, I'm talking specifically about Jamestown. So the colonists are still there. They need a charter to authorize their presence in the New World. They have to have that. So the corporate charter is revoked, and a royal charter is issued. There's no more Jamestown. There's no more Jamestown Company. There's no more London Company. No more Virginia Company. All that's dead. So now the colonists, you know, they have their own hierarchy, and there's a governor there. More about that in a moment. But it goes from the kind of the chain of command, if you will, goes from the subject of the crown, the ordinary people, to the governor. More about that in a second. To the king. And there's no more London Company. There's no more in between. That's the way it is. Now, there are several governors, but the only one I really want you to know about in the Jamestown Colony is that guy that's there in the picture. 1642, Governor William Berkeley. Now, the dates below, 1606 to 1677, you know, that's the date that he was alive. But he's going to be the governor from 1642. There will be other previous ones, but he's the one I want you to know about. So, let's look at this one more time. He is the governor from 1642 to 1677. What would that be? 35 years he's going to be the governor there. And so as you can imagine, William Berkeley, we're going to run into this guy again. He's very influential in the building of the colony. He's going to, you know, take it from this struggling, you know, little seaside village, and he's going to turn it into an actual, you know, productive, thriving, vibrant community. And, you know, he worked for 35 years and just poured all of his time and energy into building this colony and turning it into something. So, William Berkeley, we are going to run into him again. Well, with that in mind, let's continue on with the next slide. And we're continue to talk about government here. Now, for the first 168 years of American history, our government was a parliamentary form of government. I've mentioned this before, let me mention it again now. The only ones that really had a vote were people that had land. Back in England, the only people that have a vote are the people that have land. As time is going on here, we're talking about the House of Commons especially. Those are the landowners. Now you can see there on the right-hand side of the slide there, I have a picture of an early English Parliament, and you can see the king is actually seated there. And to his right are some of the lords. To the left are some of the, some of the upper prelates of the church. And in the foreground are all the bishops and all the church officers. And so in those early years, the king actually sat. He was there in Parliament. And the lords would come to him and say, okay, this is what we're thinking, all the barons and bishops and all the dukes and all that. They would say, okay, well, here's the things that we need to do. Then kind of down there at the bottom of that part of the slide, that image, all the guys that are standing there, well, those are all the commoners. And this is the church prelates, and then the cities. They all had individuals there that they could send up there, especially the city of London. The city of Bristol was the second city back in those days. And so they could approach the king and say, well, here are the problems that we want solved. There may be some major landowners down there that had their own agents, and they would say, okay, these are the things we need to get fixed. But as time goes on, the king is basically out of Parliament, and this is a series of change of governments that we don't really need to talk about now. And you get what we're kind of looking at there on the left-hand side of the slide. The guy down there in that great big chair, that's the Speaker of the House. And on the one side, usually the left as you're looking at it, that is the Tories. Those are the conservatives. Those are the pro-king. And on the opposite side, those will later on, they'll be known as Whigs. And they're more like the money men and the commoners. Okay, so they're all loyal to the king. Let that fact be known. But what I want you guys to get out of this, and I have it there on the slide, parliamentary form of government is very, very deeply adversarial. The way it works, one guy gets up and he says, okay, he gets recognized by the speaker, and usually it's the prime minister or the secretary of the treasury, really is what we would call him today. And he would get up and he'd say, okay, this is what I'm thinking, and these are the laws that I think we ought to do, and here's the adjustments we need to make. And then he would sit down. And on the other side of Parliament, one of their guys would get up, the spokesman for the other side, the opposition party. He would get up and he'd say, well, this is what I think, and this is what I think is you're doing wrong, and here's the things that we think ought to be doing right. And Parliament is very, very adversarial. YouTube it. Today they have what's called Prime Minister's Questions, and I urge you to YouTube that. That stuff is crazy. These guys are like yelling at each other. They're not throwing anything, but they're talking about, they'll call each other the right honorable gentleman, and then they'll like curse each other and call each other filthy names, and they're just almost at each other's throats all the time. So it's a very immediate form of government. In other words, everybody can see that government is working. Here are the problems that are faced out there in the country, and here's how it's getting settled out. Now, strong note here, at the time frame we're talking about, the 1620s, Parliament was not then an absolute necessary part of government. The king could, and the king did, rule for long periods without Parliament. He could call a Parliament, and then he could, what they do, it's a strange, like, legal phrase, he could prorogue Parliament. He could prorogue it. He could say, okay, you guys, you've done all the good you need to do, and I'm the king, and I'm dismissing you. And you're dismissed until I call another Parliament. And so then Parliament, they can say, listen, we've taken care of all the business we need to take care of, and we're not doing any good. Let's, we're ready to disband until, your Royal Majesty, you call the Parliament again, and we'll solve more problems. So, for example, Charles I, he ran the country for almost 7 years with no Parliament at all. But he needed more taxes and more taxes and more taxes because government was getting big and he had to deal with wars. And the only way he could raise taxes, you had to call a Parliament. Well, when Parliament sat, they wanted to solve all the problems. And there's a lot of yelling back and forth. And, the king's side, the Tory side, they were always on the defense. So Charles I would get really mad about that, and he would prorogue Parliament again. Very famously, for those of you guys who are aware of this, they had a Parliament called the Short Parliament. And then, it only lasted a few weeks. And he said, listen, you guys are going to give me the tax money that I want so I can go fight these wars. Or I'm going to just, prorogue Parliament. I'm going to send you all home again. Well, Parliament said, we're willing to give you the money, but we got to talk about these other problems, mostly religious problems, because the Puritans were having a hell of a time. And the king said, no, that's a Church of England issue, and, that's me exclusively, and I'll deal with that. So either give me the money I want or go home. Well, they said, okay, well, we're going to go home because we want to solve all these other problems. And, it just led, eventually, they stopped talking, and that will lead, in 1642, that will lead to the English Civil War. So from 1642 to 1649, there was a civil war because Parliament and the king could not get along. So this is very, very adversarial, and this was our form of government all the way until we get the Articles of Confederation in 1777. Okay? So parliamentary form of government. Don't forget that. So we're continuing on with the development of the colonies. We need to go ahead and talk a little bit about population growth. So these two maps here, we're not going to spend much time on this slide, but I do want you to pay close attention. These two maps are very, very indicative of what's going on in terms of the population. So we're going to talk about the left-hand side of the map. I'm sorry, the right-hand side of the map first, the one's got all the little slashes on it. And this is, if you'll take a look at the legend down there, you'll see that these are the major immigrant groups. And here we are. It's really the mid-1600s going towards the 1700s. So you can see there are English. There are a few Africans. They're all pinned onto the coast, and we've kind of talked about that when we talked about the Jamestown colony. We've talked about there's Scots-Irish. There's going to be several uprisings in Scotland, and a lot of the Scottish Highlands are always going to be overpopulated, so they're going to emigrate to America. There's a bunch of Germans. You can see that kind of red area up there where Pennsylvania's at. This is the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, this is a corruption of the phrase Deutsch. The Pennsylvania Dutch are not Dutch. The Pennsylvania Dutch are Germans. These are Moravians. And again, there's all these religious wars going on in Europe, and they won't end until the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And so there's this huge influx of people trying to escape one war after another, after another, after another back in Europe. And these wars are horrible. They are religious wars. Everybody's fighting for religious reasons. And as you can imagine, you're fighting for the well-being of your soul. So there can't be any there can't be any compromise, or you'll wind up in hell. So if you're a Protestant, you can't go back to Catholicism. You don't want to go to hell. If you're a Catholic, you can't turn Protestant. You'll go to hell. So these are really, really terrible, terrible wars. Again, you'll see kind of that kind of gray-green color down at the bottom of the legend, the Highland Scots. The Highlands are always going to be overpopulated. There's just not enough. You know, people are having babies left, right, and center, but the economy is like devastatingly low. So people are going to escape to the New World. And then finally, you're going to have a few French. They're going to be running away from all these terrible. These are French Huguenots, and Huguenots are French Protestants. Well, they were welcomed in France for a long time, from really the 1650s all the way till I think 1704, when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. Don't hold me to that date. I'm pretty sure that's right, but that might not be entirely correctly. But anyway, then they became under pressure again because they were Protestants, so they had to run for it. And most of them went to England. A few went to Belgium, and some went to Holland, but many of them are going to come to the American colonies. So here we have all this huge melee of various Europeans. Strong note here. The dynamic that I want you guys to get out of these new waves of immigration goes like this. Please take a very, very strong note here, because there's a dynamic that happens right now today. When these new immigrants arrive, this is not a caterpillar effect. New waves of immigrants, when they arrive, they do not push the people who are here inland further. That's not the way it works. Instead, it's a leapfrog effect. When new immigrants arrive, the people that were along the coastline kick the new immigrants inland. I'll say that again. When new immigrants arrive, the people who are already there in America kick the immigrants to the interior. They say to them, you got to go further west. You got to deal with the Native Americans. You got to break out new land. In the time frame we're talking about, going into the 1680s, okay, a lot of the land is already spoken for by the people who are already there. So when Germans, for example, come in, or Scottish come in, they get kicked to the interior. That's why the Pennsylvania Dutch went to Pennsylvania. They didn't settle on the coast. They got kicked inland, which is good for them because that part of Pennsylvania is really, really arable. It's just like Germany. So let's take a look then at the other side of the maps up here. And these are the Native Americans. And you can kind of see their names up there. There's the you know the kind of looking down lower at the lower end of the map. The Tuscarora moving up. The Powhatans, we've already run into them. Then you get into I don't know, up around Lake Ontario. That's the Iroquois Nation. We'll run into those guys again later on when we start talking about the Pennsylvania colony. And the Iroquois Nation is made up of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and Seneca, and later on the Tuscarora. They'll be kicked out of North Carolina and they'll move north. So linguistically, the Tuscarora, they're Iroquoian. And so what I want you guys, the note that I want you guys to take right now is it goes like this, and this is really, really important. In the time frame we're talking about, the Native Americans have not been pushed inland. They still occupy that area along the coastline. Look very closely where modern-day Massachusetts is at now. The tribe that you see up there are the Wampanoags. You'll need them in just a second. And in fact, in the very next slide, you're going to need those guys. So the Native Americans and the Europeans are intermixed along the coastline. They have not been pushed inland yet. Now, I talked about this a long time ago, I think in like the first series of slides, and I said, like, pay attention to this dynamic. The Europeans are going to arrive, and most of the Native Americans are going to die by disease. But then there's going to be this war, and again, I've talked about this before, about that cycle of conflict. And then that's when they get pushed inland. But that hasn't happened yet. So now it's 1675, and that's what happens next, especially up in Massachusetts. And then we'll talk about what's going on down in the Virginia Bay Colony. So with that, let's talk about King Philip's War. Next slide. So there's a lot going on here. Let's set the stage on this and figure out what's going on with King Philip's War, 1675-1676. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the illustration. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a really crude drawing, but this is probably drawn from life. In other words, that's more or less what he looked like. And hopefully you guys can tell the difference. You can see the similarities between this rather naive, crude drawing on the left and this more sophisticated drawing on the right. You can tell that one is, you know, the drawing on the right is taken from the drawing on the left. Well, let's start at the start on this. And again, this is all about image analysis. And I told you guys it was going to be an important part of this class. Now you've got to use it. So what I want you guys to do, and if you've got to look back in your notes, look back in your notes. Don't guess. Don't get, you know, just press pause and look back on your notes. What was that list of trade goods? The trade goods that the French were bringing. If you'll recall, it was knives and hatchets, iron pots and pans. It was brightly colored cloth, brightly colored beads, and finally musket shot and powder. And musket shot and powder always goes together. Now let's apply that to what King Philip is wearing there. You can see he's got brightly colored cloth, that blue cloak that he's wearing. He's got a belt, and you can imagine that that's made by beadwork. He's got a musket right there in his hand, that powder horn underneath his arm there. That's the powder in the shot is going to be in that. You can tell it better on the image on the right. He's got that big star. Okay, that's a big brass star. And brass, as you can imagine, it doesn't rust at all. And they're very, very shiny. And the Native Americans really did like that sort of thing. So here is Metacomet. He's trading and talking to the English, especially up there in the Plymouth Bay Colony in Massachusetts. And he's saying, okay, here's the things that I'm going to give you guys that you need, you English, but you've got to give me stuff. And he wants trade goods. And so the English are going to give him all the trade goods that he needs. Musket shot and powder, glass beads, brightly colored cloth. He's getting all the stuff that, you know, he would like to have. So when we talk about this dynamic of the English up there in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, I mentioned before, let me mention again, they're always going to have fairly good relationship with the Native Americans. They want land, that's all they ever want, the English. But in order to get the land, they're going to give all these trade goods to these great sachems that like Metacomet. By the way, it's spelled Metacomet, but it's said Metacomet. That's what my instructor back in the day, Professor Collins, told me, and so that's the way I say it to you guys. Now, this is important. It'll be important in just a second. Metacomet and King Philip are the same guy. to increase a positive relationship with the English, he symbolically became a Christian. And as a Christian, symbolically, they gave him a Christian name, Philip. And so he's King Philip. King Philip and Metacomet are the same guy. His Native American name is Metacomet. And again, he's one of the great sachems. He's Wampanoag, but he has control over several of the other tribes that are in the area, especially the Narragansetts. And so he has control over many thousands of individuals. Well, that's where the problems come. So the English are like coming over and more all the time. They're arriving and they're saying, look, we want land, we want land, we want land. And the English go to whoever the great sachem is, in this case Metacomet, and say, you got to give us more land. Well, after a while, Metacomet is getting very, very nervous about this. And that leads us to our next reminder here. And that's that cycle of war with the Native Americans. Again, if you need to look that up in your notes, press pause and look that up in your notes. But if you recall, to make a long story short, that cycle of war goes like this. There's encroachment, then Native American reaction, then a war breaks out, and the Native Americans are usually initially successful. Then the English come back with teamwork and technology. Teamwork allows them to fight in the winter, and technology is invariably guns. Last but not least, the last step, the fifth step, the English are going to wipe out the Native Americans, grab the land, and then the cycle begins again. So if you need to go back in your notes, take a look. But now what we're going to do is take this 5-step process and we're going to put it into practical application. And that's King Philip's War, 1675, 1676. The dates are kind of important here because you're going to need them on the next series of slides. So let's take a look at King Philip's War and take that 5-step process and put it into practical application. If I were you, what I would do is take all of those 5 steps, write the first step down, and then leave a gap. Write the second step down, leave a gap. Write the third step down, leave a gap. And then on the very next slide, we're going to go through that step by step. And then on the following slides, subsequent slides, we'll go through this and we're going to get the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts. We're going to get them finished off. All right. So let's proceed on and talk about King Philip's War, 1675, 1676. King Philip's War, 1675, 1676. So I think the best way to go about this is to show you guys a map and then kind of talk you through it. So this is what Massachusetts kind of looked like going into 1675. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is all of the communities that are moving out into central and western Massachusetts. But between all these communities are the Narragansetts and the Wampanoags. They live in between these. So in between all these communities is a gap of maybe 20, 30, 50 miles, something like that. Massachusetts is a fairly large state, colony at the time. Furthermore, all of these communities are real small. They're very, very tiny. Now, my primary resource on this is none other than Francis Parkman. And Francis Parkman, this era of colonialism, is that was his big deal. And all the records are still there. So he spent years and years and years going back to the old records, which are all still there, and he wrote a very, very readable, to this very day, very readable history of early colonialism, Francis Parkman. And so he was writing this and doing all his research in the 1870s, 1880s, right into the early 20th century. He took a look at the French records, he took a look at the American records, the English records. He was very good at this. So I'm relying really on Francis Parkman for King Philip's War. So here we go. Now, the first step then is encroachment. And you can kind of, just use your common sense. You can see that the English are already encroaching. They have all these communities out there with Native Americans surrounding them. And there can't help but be friction. But let's narrow that down, and let me give you a couple of examples. One of these is in the book, and the other one is not. So let's talk about the one that's not in the book. Out near the coastline, fishing was a big deal. That was a huge resource for the Native Americans. Those waters are icy cold all winter long, and that's, as it turns out, that's like a big giant breeding ground for every kind of fish. And fishing was a huge resource. And the easiest way to go fishing is to use a weir, and this is W-E-I-R. It's a phrase you're unfamiliar with. And so the way a weir works is you wait for the tide to go out, and then you go out as far as ever you can go with the tide out, and you stick a bunch of sticks, drive a bunch of posts down into the seabed. And then in between all these posts, you put a whole bunch of nets. Well, sooner or later, the tide's going to come back in. Well, as it turns out, 12 hours later, the tide will come in. And so all these fish are swimming around, and your net is like deep underwater. Well, then when the tide goes back out, all the fish are trapped. And that's some easy fishing right there. All you got to do is go out there and get them, knock them on the head, and then you can like dry all these fish. So you can imagine that a fish weir is like a really, really important piece of equipment. Well, it came to pass that the English were running across all these Native American fish weirs and destroying them in an effort to, like, you know, kick the Native Americans out, induce them to leave. So the Native Americans went to the English. They went to their king, King Philip, Metacomet, and said, look, you got to go to the English, and we need trade goods. You know, they got to pay for that. We want their brightly colored cloth and all the other cool stuff in payment for this damage that they've done to us. Well, the English were saying, well, you know, you got to catch the guys that actually did that. They didn't want to give up on any trade goods. And so there's friction from that. Another element of friction, and this is not really in your book, is that the English are like really bad about hunting out all the deer. This was like an easy target for them. They just go out there with their musket. There was deer like everywhere. If you go to Massachusetts, deer everywhere, even today. And you just shoot down all the deer. Even back in those days, they had there was like a western subspecies of buffalo, and they would hunt that out. And there's a western species of elk, and they would hunt that out. The English would. And the English, the Native Americans really resented that because it meant that this resource that they depended upon was being systematically destroyed. And it was. And again, Metacomet is going to go to the English and say, listen, you guys got to dial it back a little bit. You know, you have sheep, eat that. You have cows, eat that. But don't be hunting out all of the game animals that we Native Americans depend upon. Well, the English weren't paying attention to them. They didn't care. The example of encroachment that's in your book goes like this. There was a group of Native Americans that had switched to Protestantism, that had switched to the Christian faith. And they were collectively referred to as praying Indians. Your book will talk about this a lot. Well, it came to pass, and again we're talking about encroachment here, it came to pass that there was a murder in one of the English communities. And all the English went to each other and they said, well, did you do it? No, I didn't do it. Well, did you do it? No, I didn't do it. Well, it turns out everybody, you know, they finally got around to it. They were going to accuse these Native Americans, these praying Indians. They said it wasn't one of us, it had to be one of them. And so the accusation went against these praying Indians that they had murdered an Englishman. And so some of these praying Indians were going to be put on trial, and then they were on, you know, they were on trial for their lives. Well, Metacomet approached the English and said, no, now listen, they may be praying Indians, but those are still my people. They belong to me. I am their king. And if you have trouble, you know, let's work it out between us. But you're not going to hang these people. You're not going to do that. And the English said, no, we're going to hang them, and they did. So again, this friction is like building up. It's not one or two or three things. It's lots and lots of different things. And that's the nature of encroachment. So again, we're just putting this into practical application now. Well, the next step then is encroachment. The first step was encroachment. The next step is Native American reaction. Again, write a strong note here, Native American reaction. Now, I disagree with your book on this. I mentioned before at the beginning of class that there were going to be times when I disagree with your book, and this is one of them. Because the Native American dynamic here is a little bit convoluted, but the version I'm going to give you makes better sense than what the book says. So the Native American reaction for Metacomet, strong note here, he is going to go talk to the Iroquois. I mentioned them on a previous slide. If you need to go back and take a look at the map, go take a look at the map. But Metacomet is going to travel, 100 miles out to the west and talk to the Iroquois. And he's going to say to the Iroquois, listen, we need to team up and knock all these English on the head and throw them into the sea, because you guys are next. And he basically said that to the Iroquois. Well, the Iroquois and the Narragansetts and Wampanoags, they had not gotten along. They'd had little wars and tiffs in the past. So the Iroquois said, no, we're not going to help you. We're not going to do that. And so Matacomet said, okay, just remember this later on. When you're in trouble, you know, we'll do what we can to help you guys in turn. But, okay, I got to go back and fight these English by myself. And he did. Now, we're not done with that, because your book will talk about, we're talking about the Iroquois here again in a minute. Well, the English find out that Matacomet went and talked to the Iroquois about a war against the English. And so tensions are very high. But the war broke out, and initially, so we're at the next step, step 3, the war broke out, and initially the Native Americans are successful. So let's kind of zoom in on one, and you can see there Deerfield, kind of that big red dot out there on the western end of Massachusetts. Deerfield, and it's the attack is going to be like late in the year. There's going to be snow on the ground. And Francis Parkman wrote a wonderful little vignette about this. We know a lot about Deerfield because the storekeeper, you know, the guy that ran the dry goods store there, he was a meticulous record keeper, and he wrote everything down in journals. You know, whose cows are having calves, and how much wool did they bring in from the sheep, and who's dating who. He wrote down everything. And evidently, when the Native Americans attacked, he was writing in his journal, and literally, he's like, okay, some Native Americans just kicked in the door, and now I'm getting tomahawked. Basically, that's what he said in his journal. It's crazy. And the journal still exists, and it's all splattered with blood. So we know a lot about Deerfield. There were about 600 people there. The attack came late in the night. It's December. It's very, very cold. There's a lot of snow on the ground. And this is uncharacteristic of the Native Americans, but it shows the desperation that they're in. They attacked in winter, and they would like never ordinarily do that. But they burned Deerfield to the ground. I can't overemphasize this. Deerfield was wiped out. Some of these other villages that are out there are destroyed. So the attack, and you can see that, they're all the way out to Halifax, and they're all the way out near the coast, Bridgewater. And so this attack on these English villages was almost successful. They almost did it, the Narragansetts and Wampanoags by themselves. But as often happens, their attack basically ran out of steam. They just ran out of resources. So the English are going to come back. So the very next step, they're going to come back with their teamwork and technology. Now, the English do pull together as a team. The survivors like move out to the west coast. I'm sorry, to the east coast. They find themselves in and around Boston. The governor at the time, whose name escapes me, he's like sends out a call to all the able-bodied men, and he says, like, show up. Let's start doing some militia training. He tells everybody in the colony, listen, I want you guys to go out there and like work really, really, really hard, and do everything you can to raise money, and we're going to tax the crap out of you. And that way you can feed the militiamen, and you can clothe them, and you can take care of their families while they get trained up and go fight the Indians. And that did happen. Strong note there. The English did pull together, and they used their teamwork and their technology, which is always guns, and we've already talked about that. So they began to counterattack against the Native Americans. Now, the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts, you know, they've already got their backs against the wall. They've used up all the resources. So with that, let's go to the next slide and talk about the end for the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts and for Matacomet, King Philip. So the very end of this, and I probably should have some bullet points up there, but the very end of this, the Native Americans are going to go down to near modern-day Providence, Rhode Island. Providence, Rhode Island is kind of on the left side of this map here. And this had been their usual place of refuge. You can see down there kind of in the south part of that peninsula, Mount Hope and King Philip's Chair. So the Native Americans had always gone in here as their final refuge. And there were only a few pathways to get in. And so what the Native Americans could do then is barricade themselves in, regain their strength, get themselves pulled all together again, and then counterattack out. Wait for the enemy to like run out of resources. That had always been their pathway before. Well, the English, this is a whole new type of war. So what the English do is put a bunch of boats and canoes and like that out there in the bay area to keep the Native Americans from escaping. And then they got their military force and they just picked one of these pathways and they just started fighting their way down through there, shooting everybody in their path. Now, at the same time, and I want you guys to please write a strong note here. At the same time, so now we're talking about 1676, the Iroquois launched an attack against the Wampanoags. The Iroquois did not attack the English. They attacked King Philip and his people, Matacomet and his people. In other words, they saw an advantage for themselves. And rather than join up with King Philip and fight the English, they fought for themselves against the Wampanoags and Narragansetts. And this is where I disagree with your book. Your book suggests that the Iroquois teamed up with the English, and that is not true. That's not true. The Iroquois were in it for themselves. They saw an advantage, and they took it, and they stabbed the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts in the back. And this is going to be a continued dynamic. The Iroquois in particular, they're in it for themselves. They feel themselves to be militarily very strong, and that they can fight anybody. And that was a tremendous underestimation of the white man, but that's a separate issue, and we'll talk about that later on. So King Philip is killed in all this. Matacomet is killed. Many of his people were killed and wiped out. Iroquois observers talk about how the English were merciless. The Iroquois, in their war dynamic, their military dynamic, if they could capture women and children, they would simply adopt them into their tribe, and that would make their tribe all the stronger. But the English aren't having it. What they'll do is they'll surround one of these villages and use fire as a weapon. They'll throw in, they'll use fire. They'll throw in lit torches and like that and catch the village on fire. Well, for the Native Americans that are in the village, they'll make a run for it, assuming that, okay, they're burned out. They might be taken prisoner and, turned into, adopted into to the English. Well, that's not what happened. The English simply gave them the firing squad. You catch their village on fire, and when they run out, you just shoot them. And the Iroquois were shocked by this. They were like, what the heck is going on here? These English were like, wow, this is a new way of going about it. So the last note I want you guys to take on this is a very sad note indeed. The English are going to take a few prisoners, probably less than just a few thousand prisoners, but then sell them all into slavery in Bermuda. There are more Wampanoags and Narragansetts in Bermuda than there are in New England. They sold them out as slaves. And you can imagine these Native Americans, they're going to go to Bermuda way up there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, basically in Caribbean waters, essentially. And that's going to be completely different. And most of them are going to die. They're exterminated. So this is the beginning of that simple dynamic. Many of these Native Americans die of disease, and they did. But when they fight, they're going to be wiped out. They're going to be exterminated. And so if you refer back to our map of Massachusetts, it wasn't before, where the Native Americans had been between all of those villages, by 1680, that's no longer the case. They are wiped out. They are kicked out on the other side of the Hudson River Valley. They're sent off to, basically they all died. That's what happened. The ones that didn't die of disease, they got kicked out, or they were, a few of them are going to be adopted by other tribes, especially a little bit north to the Algonquians, but they're all dead. So that's the beginning of this dynamic. So let's move on. I'm done talking about King Philip's War, and we're almost done with this series of on this lecture. But we need to go on and talk now about the next major dynamic, and this is also in 1675, and this is Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 1675. 16 In this slide, we're going to talk about our first major rebellion. And this is, again, this is a building block. Please take strong notes here. Very strong notes indeed. Now, the rebellion is going to be between, and I have it down there as a bullet point, the haves versus the have-nots. So let's start at the start. We have there Governor Sir William Berkeley. We've talked about him before. He was the governor since 1642. And by this time, it's 1675. And this is a very thriving community. Refer back to one of those maps that we talked about earlier on, and I have a map coming up in a moment. And the English have pushed deep inland. Back in England, there's a series of civil wars from 1642 to 1649. And then you have a long period called the Interregnum, which is also very disruptive. And that was 1649 to 1660. And so there's a lot of new people like coming into the colony. They're just flooding in. And William Berkeley takes these new people coming into the colonies, these new immigrants. And again, I've mentioned this before just a few minutes ago. He's going to kick them out to the frontier. And so these new immigrants, they've got to break out the land. They've got to deal with the Native Americans. They're going to be living rough for a long time. You know, William Berkeley said, that's what I had to do when I got here, so that's what you've got to do now that you're here. You've got to go out to the frontier and cut it out for yourself. Now that leads us then to Sir Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Sir Nathaniel Bacon, again, we've seen this dynamic before, and as soon as I say it, you'll be like, okay, I know what's going on here. Nathaniel Bacon was minor petty nobility. He was a knight of the Shire. And so, but he was poor. And he'd been in England throughout the English Civil War, and he'd seen all that as a young man. Well, he concludes what he's going to do is go to the New World and make a name for himself, make out, become a big landowner, be a big shot, the local big shot. Well, he had a sort of advantage. He had an in, because he was related to William Berkeley. So Nathaniel Bacon takes ship. He comes to the New World, and he's like, hey, Unky, you got to help me out. I want a big giant plantation. I want, a whole bunch of servants, and I want to run the show. Well, imagine then Berkeley, who'd been there since 1642, and he's like, no, that's not the way it works. Nephew, that's not how it's going to work. You got to go up to the frontier, and I'll help you out as much as I can. But if you want a big mansion, you better get an axe, and you better get a saw, and you better pay a bunch of people to make you a mansion. And if you want advantages, I'll try and help you out. But you got to carve it out for yourself. You got to do the work. So again, really strong note here. The difference here is that Nathaniel Bacon, he had seen a successful rebellion back in England. He had been involved in a minor way in the English Civil War, 1642-1649. And so he had seen that. So he's like, what? Okay, well, you're an authority figure, Sir William Berkeley, but, I'm disgruntled. He's the have-not. So sure enough, he goes out to the frontier, and he starts telling all the colonists that are out there who have no advantages at all. He's like, listen, William Berkeley, my uncle, he's corrupt, and he's taking advantage of all of you. You guys are doing all the work. But he controls the dockyards. And he's not letting your produce go out of the colony unless he puts a tax on it, or unless he cuts a deal that's advantage to himself. He's not dealing with the Native Americans for animal skins and like that in a fair way. He's cutting you guys out of the profits. So Bacon goes out there and riles all these guys up. He plays upon their susceptibilities, and he talks about them and says, so I'm here to lead you in this rebellion. Now, strong note here. To the people out on the frontier, their main enemy is not going to be William Berkeley or the guys near the coast. Their main enemy is the Native Americans. So Berkeley's like, what? Your main enemy is the Native Americans? Okay, you know what? I'm going to let you go out there and kill them all. So this is our one exception to the five-step process. William Berkeley had worked hard to have a positive relationship with the Native Americans, and that had worked. Disease was killing most of them anyway. But along comes Nathaniel Bacon, and he says, okay, we're just going to go out there and kill them all without any justification at all, and he did. The next map will make that clear. But then when the colonists, the angry colonists, got done killing a bunch of innocent Native Americans, then Nathaniel Bacon said, okay, well, now you got to help me, and we're going to go after Berkeley. So then the colonists said, okay, well, we'll do that. All right, well, now we need to go to Berkeley for a moment, and please write down strong notes here. This is the only reason we're spending a lot of time and effort on this. So Berkeley, as soon as he realized he had a rebellion on his hands, strong note here, he wrote a very strong letter to the king in 1675. It had to be Charles II. And so he wrote a letter to Charles II. He said, listen, I got a rebellion on my hands, and I need some help. And he put that on a fast ship and, you know, sent it off to England. So Berkeley, he's really nervous about this. He's afraid of what's going on. He got so afraid that he and some of his buddies, the rich, wealthy, elite buddies that were all the big landowners, they took refuge on a ship out in the harbor because they thought Bacon was coming to get them, which was true. But then the situation becomes very anticlimactic. Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery, drank some bad water. You know, it's hot down there in Virginia, and he drank some water that was like really, really bad. And, you know, he got an intestinal ailment, and he died of dysentery. Dysentery, for those of you guys who don't know, that means you get bacteria in your intestines that kills the good bacteria. And then basically you can't digest anything, you can't hold anything in. And so you basically go to the bathroom until you die. Well, that's what happened to Nathaniel Bacon. So William Berkeley gets control of the situation. Again, continue on with really strong notes here. This will be important in a minute. So Berkeley reasserts his authority, and he gets control of the situation. He starts hanging people left, right, and center because they were rebels. And he gets them, and he traps them, and he like hangs them up for their rebellion. And so the rebellion is then crushed. Well, so take a look back at your notes real quick, and let's discover what is not, you know, we got to have a resolution here. What do we need to resolve? The letter that went back to England, that's what we've got to resolve. Now, again, continue on. Please continue with strong notes here. This will be important like way later on. We're going to run into this again and again and again. The letter got back to England, and Charles II is going to take this rebellion very seriously. I've mentioned this before. You know, his father had been killed in a rebellion in 1649, Charles I. His father had been killed, beheaded. So Charles II is not going to put up with rebellion at all. He doesn't like it. He's not going to have it. But think what he has to do to project an army to Virginia. He's got to get a force up. He's got to pay those guys. He's got to get the army pulled together. They have to take every piece of supplies with them. If they need shoelaces, it has to come from England. So tents, musket, shot, powder, food, equipment, you know, more equipment, tents, blankets, all the things that they could possibly need in Virginia, they have to take every bit of that with them. And so this requires a vast treasure of ships, which are very expensive. The Royal Navy was like, it was in its infancy at the time, and they had almost no transport ships. So transport ships have to be rented. So the Crown has to rent transport ships. They got to load up all the men, get them all trained up, and then load them. And they got to load all the cannons. They got to load all the equipment and horses and supplies. The special ship for all that. And so this is going to cost a vast treasure of money. So finally, the fleet arrives. And Berkeley's like, you know, hey guys, wow, it's really great to see you. Awesome. I'm glad you guys are here. But as it turns out, the rebellion's been over for a while, and I'm in charge now. So again, very strong notes here. This is where I want you guys to box your notes in, underline it, fingers and arrows, go get some glitter from Michael's, like, you know, really illuminate this thing. Neon lights, got to have it. The question then is, who is going to pay for this armed force to come all the way from England to Virginia? Who will pay for colonial defense? This is a big deal. Bear in mind that William Berkeley could not call upon the colonists up in Massachusetts. They had to deal with Matacamet. The colonists up in Massachusetts could not call upon the guys down in Virginia because they had to deal with Bacon's rebellion. So Berkeley had no choice. He had to call on England for support. And they're there. And Berkeley says, well, thanks. Wow, it's really great that you guys are here. So the immediate question is, who's going to pay? And the king says, strong note here, the king says, you guys in Virginia, you colonists, you have to pay. Strong note here. Berkeley says, no, we're not going to pay. We're not going to pay because, number one, it's the king's direct personal responsibility to protect us. So the king has to pay. You have to pay for that out of your own pocket. It's your job. You have to protect us. I called for help. You sent help. Okay, good for you. That was your job. So I'm not going to pay. Second, Berkeley says, the colony is cash poor. They have no cash. They have no money to pay. So they're not going to pay. Furthermore, Berkeley says, it is against our authority. It's against our constitutions that existed, our charter, for England to pass taxes in England that apply to the colonies where the money will go back to England. That is not in the charter. So you can't do that. So we're not going to pay. We're not going to pay. But what did the king say? And the king's forces, no, you have to pay for this. You guys called for it. You needed the help. This was highly expensive. You guys got to pay. And Berkeley said, no, we're not going to pay. We have no money. It's the king's responsibility to pay, and the law is on our side. There's no law that says taxes passed in Parliament apply to us here in such a way that the money has to go back to England. We will tax ourselves. I paid for this, crushing this rebellion myself. I paid for that. So we're not going to pay. And what did the king's forces say? No, you have to pay. And what does William Berkeley say? We're not going to pay. So, again, strong note here. Put this in like all caps. The issue is unresolved. There's no resolution to this. Now, the king sent a message. Messages are going back and forth. It's going to take a while. But the king finally says a message. Charles II says a message, and he says, arrest William Berkeley and bring him back to England. And so William Berkeley was arrested not for the money. William Berkeley was arrested for having hanged all of those rebels without trial. And he had to go back to England and answer for that. Well, as it turns out, the reason why this is all unresolved is that William Berkeley will die on the way back to England. He's on the ship. And so here he is disgraced. He's under arrest. It's horrible. He put his life into this colony, grew it. It was successful because of him. But then at the very end of his life, there's this terrible rebellion, and he's getting all the blame. So the ship, carrying William Berkeley, arrives back in England. Well, he's dead. So there is no resolution. There's no resolution to who will pay. Now, as you can imagine, we're going to run into this all again when we get to the 7 Years' War. And that's the big deal. So make sure in your notes you dog-ear this. You indicate this in your notes. Put a little tab or something on there where you can find this one later, because we're going to revisit this issue. This idea of who's going to pay for colonial defense, it is not over with. All right, well, let me go on to a map. We'll only take a couple of minutes on that, and then we're done with this part of the presentation. So the map kind of shows a lot. There's a lot going on. That kind of dark blue color, that kind of periwinkle color, I guess that's what it is. That is the extent of the colony in 1675. And you can see that from 1607, where they just had one tiny little town. Here we are in 1675, and the English have pushed way, way inland. They're up on the Delaware coast as well, and they're all up and down the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay, for those of you guys who don't know, is really rich in terms of fishing. And so, and the land is really, really rich as you get down to the sea. Plus, you have access to the sea all along the coastline. So you can do a whole lot of trading. Now, those red lines there, the red arrows, that is Bacon. And he's talking to these disgruntled rebels. And he's saying, yeah, go out there and attack all the Native Americans you can find. So they went to a peaceful village, Pamunkey there, and they wiped out a whole bunch of Powhatans. And then they went all the way out to Okankakee, and they wiped out a whole bunch of Cherokee and some more Pamunkey Indians, some more Powhatans. And this is just nothing more than just plain old everyday ordinary murder. But when these disgruntled frontiersmen got back, and you can see that there's all originating from Bacon's Quarter. That's that little piece of land that Berkeley had given Bacon. I said, but you got to make it into a mansion yourself. You got to make this into a plantation yourself. Well, Bacon said, well, no, I'm just going to rebel. I want all the riches, and I don't want to do anything for it. So when they got done with that, then they went down to, they started going down towards the coast to, the Yorktown area. And they said, okay, well, we're going to we're going to find Berkeley and we're going to hang him because he's cheating us, which was not true. But then Bacon died, and, Berkeley got control of the situation and started, hanging everybody in sight, really. So what I really want you guys to get out of this thing is the Native Americans, most of them are dying of disease. But then the English come along, and in this case, really without any justification, they're going to murder some of these Native Americans and push them further inland. All right. So with that, we're going to go to the last slide and talk about what's on the next series of presentations. So we're talking about English colonialism continued expansion. We've talked about that. King Philip's War, we talked about that. Bacon's Rebellion, we've talked about that. There's another presentation out there. It's entitled 1301. And I think it says 1650 to 1688. And just look for that, because you need to talk about, it'll talk about the Dominion of New England. I'll have a presentation on witchcraft, the Great Awakening. The rest of the bullet points that are on this slide, John Peter Zinger, developing commerce, and heading towards the French and Indian Wars, that's way on down the line. So just look at the dates for those things, and your readings are in chapters 1 through 3, and that's in the text. And with that, I've sewed this all up. Thank you once again for your attention.